The very first episode of our podcast focused on the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh and highlighted the role of designers in alleviating the living conditions of the refugees. Today, we have almost come full circle as we speak to Better Shelter, a non-profit organization based out of Sweden that works towards providing safe and dignified shelters to displaced people around the world. With the support of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, we speak to Märta and Miguel from Better Shelter about working in crisis situations, how their shelters culturally adapt to specific contexts, and how they navigate the logistical challenges of deploying in disaster zones. I am Vaissnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not occupy the center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and changemakers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us. I think we should start with the first big kind of idea question on why has Better Shelter focused on temporary shelters rather than permanent solutions? And since you both have been working on it for a while, what are some of the considerations that go into deciding the type of shelter for different regions, different contexts? And if you could speak a little bit about the kind of crisis situations that you work in, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So in order to, better explain why we do what we do, we have to talk a little bit about the context we operate in first. And no one should have to live in a refugee camp or any camp-like situation for a long time. And a refugee camp it's not often dignified, nor is it safe. And a lot of camps lack what we regard as basic standards and very rarely address all the needs that a human being has to live a good and fulfilling life. So we operate in a lot of refugee camps, and it is also the final resort for UN organizations and states and authorities when a lot of people come over a border at the same time, and a lot of people need basic safety urgently, basically. And if you look at the average protracted refugee situation, that is about 20 years, more or less. That doesn't necessarily mean that people live in camps for this amount of time, but they do live in camps for many years. And in the spring, I visited, for example, a camp in Chad for Sudanese refugees who had fled the Darfur crisis in 2003. So that camp had been around for 21 years. And they were not looking to go back anytime soon, if you know what's going on in Sudan now. Same thing in Palestine, of course. I've visited camps there as well that were established 80 years ago. So with that said, camps can look very different, and a camp in Eastern Chad is very different from a camp in the West Bank, for example. So, and then just a bit about the numbers, and then we will get into what we do and why we do it. But there are now 38 million refugees in the world, more or less, and a minority, around 1/5 or so of the world's refugee population, live in camps. That's a minority, but it's still around 8 million people. That's a country. That's almost the size of Sweden that live in refugee camps. Many live in planned and managed camps, but around 2 or so million of these refugees also live in self-settled camps, so those without formal management by authorities, for example. And on top of this, we also have 75 or so million internally displaced people, so people that are displaced within the borders of their own country. These populations are much harder to keep a track of, but we know that many millions of them also live in camps. And it's, for many reasons, a life on hold. It's also, I mean, I've heard people comparing it to a life in prison, you know, an outdoor prison. And I think when I interview people, when I that live in our shelters, and you ask them, like, how is this shelter to live in? What can be improved, and so on. I often hear that, you know, that this shelter is the least of my problems. You know, I don't have enough food. We don't have the medicine we need. I can't work. I can't make a living for myself. My children can't go to school. We can't go back to where we came from. And if we leave, where would we go? And I think the problem for one of the main problems living in a refugee camp, above all of the things that I just listed, is the uncertainty, you know, not knowing for how long you're going to be there. And humans are very bad at dealing with uncertainty. If you would know that there's an end to this in year so and so, I think life would be a bit more bearable for these people. But with all of this said, of course, you escaped death by coming to a refugee camp, likely. So for many people, this is safer from what they fled from. You know, we see Gaza on TV these days, and this is what people many times flee from. So of course you would rather be in a refugee camp where there is safety and not bombs falling on your head, and you have access to healthcare, and your children can sleep quite safely at night, but it's still not somewhere you would have to live in for many years. But this is reality. So sort of that's the background to why we build temporary shelters rather than permanent ones. Do you want to fill in a little bit?
No, exactly. So yeah, in this context that we are having these first budget constraints, no, because the needs are huge. The public money, no, from the main donors, it is decreasing every year from the last at least 4 years. So it is not matching the budget and the needs. And then also we are having this legal constraint, like when you are setting up a refugee camp, it is something temporary. So no, like this is something built in that way, because the many times, because it is so uncertain, the future, the local host country government, they are not going, they don't know how many years the people is going to be there. So they cannot build, and they are also sometimes because political will, in other hand, because the lack of funding and resources, it is not built in that way. So this is the frame where we are working, and then we have to do is again the shelters temporary, actually, because they should be cheap, accessible, and then they should be not too permanent in many contexts, because it will be against the local framework. So you cannot build. Actually, our area 2, it is called Relief Housing Unit, no, one of the main our shelters. But in some contexts, they change the name in order to be able to propose it to the local authorities, and it is called the temporary shelter unit, no, like the TSU, because they want to avoid the term housing. So this is a big constraint that we are facing as well. So when we are having, that's why we are going to why we are working mainly in temporary shelters, but also as we know that many crises going to last for so many years, still they should be temporary, no? They have to be easy to disassemble and to be removed, but they should last some years. At least we are focusing like minimum 10 years to have a shelter there in order to provide some safety and to some some
I think
lifespan.
I think the factor of time is so important here, and the role of time is almost twofold. So one is, of course, the time that it takes for one to erect this particular shelter, because it has to be done fairly quickly, because you don't
Yes.
know whether it's a natural crisis, whether it's an earthquake or a tsunami, or if it's a political crisis, or if it's a war zone. The amount that you get to deploy this shelter is fairly limited and has to be done really quickly. The second aspect of time, I guess, in this context, when we're talking about temporary and permanent, is also that 20 years or 21 years you just mentioned, Märta, is a really long time to be living in a shelter. And from historical instances, at least in India, we've seen in Delhi, there's a particular area which was actually set up as a refugee camp after the 1947 partition. So during the independence, when some mass exodus of Muslims going to Pakistan and Hindus coming back to India, and there was an entire area which started as a refugee camp, and then because of this factor of time, it stayed on for so many years that it almost became a permanent fixture in a city, right? So you don't really have a control over how long or short that camp is going to be there, and whether it's actually ever even going to get formalized into some kind of a settlement or some kind of a housing. Now, I'll link, of course, in the show notes, the Better Shelter website, and you have a wonderful video explaining how the shelter is erected. It comes as a kit of parts and you put it together. And when we were initially talking about this, you did mention that it's evident to see it's a wonderfully designed mechanism, very precise, very easy to put up together. There's always a concern that if these shelters are so good, if they're providing a better quality of life than the ones that people had lived in before a certain crisis. Of course, there's no feeling of home, because a home is much more than the space you live in. It's your family, it's your history, it's all the stories that have been told in that place. But do you think there's ever a risk that such immaculately designed shelters might attract more refugees or displaced people because of the conditions that they provide? And how do you really balance the need to, on one hand, offer dignified living conditions, and then on the second, without making this into some kind of housing crisis where the number of people attracted to this place because of certain kind of shelters or amenities is more than what you are actually able to provide?
Yeah. The short answer, of course, there are different answers, but I don't think a nice shelter will ever be enough to force people to leave their homes. If it's safe enough to return or move somewhere where life is happening, a planned city where you're part of society, people will always choose that, of course. And I mean, as Miguel, you touched upon a bit before, our mission is to deliver something that is as comfortable and as safe as possible while being temporary, while lasting for as long as possible, and be as low cost as possible, and possible to implement in far to reach regions. It's a very impossible brief, right? It has to be low cost, low volume when you ship, but become big when you build it, and you should be able to build it within a few hours. It has to weigh as little as possible. It has to be scalable, but also be culturally fit. They have to provide safety and comfort, and be rainproof and snowproof and windproof. And when not needed anymore, be fully recyclable anywhere in the world. It is a very difficult brief. And I think what we've come up with is something that is trying to address all of those criteria. And I saw recently, I checked the shelter budget for the Syria response this year has been funded by 19%. So in a lot of operations where people need shelter, the organizations have a few dollars per person or per family even, which means they will end up with a tarpaulin and a few sticks, and they make something makeshift from themselves. I've seen a lot of examples of that in many parts of the world. And in Syria, for example, in northwest Syria, where we work and where there are millions of internally displaced people and really rough winters, snow and minus degrees for many months, people live like this year after year after year. So I think it's not the shelter itself that will attract people. It's something else.
Yeah, really agree. No, I've been working in different operations, sometimes and so on, and I have the feeling that always, as based on my experience, when I was working in this operation, like people, they are moving not because the quality of the shelter, no, they are triggered by other reasons, and at the end, as the budget is so low for the amount of people that you want to support. I was working in 2022 in Pakistan for the floods response, and you have hundreds of thousands of people, and it's really hard to support all of them. You are not going to do it, so you have to prioritize the vulnerable target groups and so on. But at the end of the day, every shelter counts, no? Each shelter, each family counts. So that's the way you can handle it when you see that is not proportional the resource that you have and the needs that you find. But yeah.
What I also found interesting was on your website, and you see these shelters being deployed across different weather conditions, across different geographical conditions. In a way, it was a little comforting to see people make this shelter into their own, adding nuances of their tradition, their history, their culture. I was wondering if you have any anecdotes or if you have any stories about how, through this shelter, people have been able to bring in their own cultural history, whether it is with tribal or indigenous communities, or even people maybe who've been used to living in a larger city and then are now moving into these shelters. How do you really work in these contexts, and how have you seen people adapt their own self into what is this temporary housing situation?
No, that's true. This is something that I'm enjoying a lot when you are traveling, because at the end, although we are having two kind of shelters that they are produced in the same way always, they look the same when they are in the warehouse. But when they are in the field, you can tell, as you were saying, that they are so customized by the people, no? And I love when you can tell that they are taking ownership of their space and they are adapting. And I think that this is really interesting because our shelter board deploy in many countries. And when I have the chance to visit some of the implementation programs, for instance, regarding privacy, this is a topic that we understand, all of us, but for each of us, it has a different perception. So we are facing it from the different angle. So, for instance, in the crisis in Venezuela, there are many people came into Brazil, to the north of Brazil, and they have UNHCR awesome operation, and they are hosting a lot of refugees, and they identify that the needs of the population are not the same, and they target the indigenous people. So they assemble the same shelters in a different way. So they are building the shelters with a higher roof. So they were combining them in two, because they need an extra internal structure to to have hammocks because this indigenous community, they prefer to sleep in hammocks, no, instead of mattress. So they need some extra space, and also it's really nice because as you have higher ceiling, the thermal comfort of the shelter is performing better, no? But so even when we were there like last year, I had the opportunity to talk to some indigenous ladies. They were saying, and I was super curious, like, hey, how was your home, how it looked like when you were living still in Venezuela, and how is it looking? And they say, oh no, we have like a beautiful roof, very thick, made of palm trees, and it was really refreshing and so on. And we were like in a plinth, so we were safe, so we didn't have any issues with the floods or anything. And we were talking a little bit, and then at some point I say, and what is the material of the walls? It's like, walls? There's no walls.
Mm.
We want to take the maximum of the, as much as possible, the breeze, the wind that it's crossing our shelters, our houses, because it's so hot in the rainforest. So there is no point to have, and we are having the hammock, so everything is kind of clean and open. Of course, I guess that they have some limits. Maybe the communities are smaller, or maybe they know the boundaries. No, I use them go cross this line, or maybe you have like some partition, but you don't have a closed building, a closed volume. But then when you talk to people that they are working in IDP camps, in internal displaced people camps inside Syria, the perception of privacy is completely different.
Yeah.
So they assemble two shelters for one family with a toilet in the middle, and then it has like a U-shaped courtyard, and then they close it with a fence because they prefer to enjoy the sky, but they have their own space inside. So you can tell the difference. So yeah, it is really nice to have this contrast, no? So yeah, it is the same shelter because here we are talking about the shelter with everything in a box, with the roof and the walls as well.
Yeah.
But you can tell the difference, no? Like how they customize. And when we see that they are taking, I don't know, I love when they are putting like the diploma of the drawing of the children, or maybe a mirror, no, to fix your hair before going out. So this is how we love to see they are using the shelters and they are customizing.
Yes,
right?
and treating it like you can see the difference between a tent and our shelters. It has walls, so you treat it like a house. Nobody's ever gonna. Everyone who lives in our shelters know it's not a permanent building. When you're in it, you know that no one's gonna be fooled by that. But it's still that there are walls that you can hang. It still resembles something closer to a house.
I also thought it was interesting to see the spatial interpretation of one's religious identity into these shelters, because for example, in like more conservative Muslim families, there might have to be more divisions between the men and women of the house, when it comes to prayer time or grooming time. Similarly, at a slightly larger communal level also, you would find women kind of congregating in a different way than men who would want to sit outside and have their shisha or have their have their coffee. So even while looking at the shelters from that perspective, where that one man is making his coffee or tea, just bringing their own culinary traditions or their religious identities and adapting the shelters. Of course, they are all same throughout, but then, the adaptability of it was very interesting. Now, since Märta, you mentioned you've been to Palestine and you've been to all these different sites and countries where you are deploying better shelters. What would a typical process of deploying these shelters look like? How does one start? Can you walk us through the logistical challenges of how you enter? Is it through a UN government agency? Is it through local governments? Is it self-initiated? What is the mode of engagement? And then at the back end, I would love to know how you guys coordinate it, with the team, and what are the kind of roles people have? How is it? Well, of course, shipping is the easier part, but then, who oversees? Okay, maybe not,
I
maybe
get
not.
what you mean,
But
yeah.
then,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
teaches people to, like read the kit of parts, or who takes over the site execution for it? So if you can just talk about the overall
Mhm.
cycle.
Yeah. I mean, maybe do you want to start, Miguel, because you're so deep
Yeah.
deep into training our colleagues in the other organizations and so on. But I mean, we can partnership is key,
Yeah,
and we're not the ones that decide where the shelters go. That's our local partners.
exactly. So that's I will say, like, the most important thing that we have. Yeah. So yeah, at the end, when you are deciding the shelter situation, we are setting options, but the decision makers are the people close to the field, and this is really important to have this in mind. No? Like, when you are having this first conversations to see, oh, it is a fit or it is not. It can be has potential for here or not. This is something that we discuss together, and we try to have like an open discussion. And also, when it comes to the implementation itself, how they are going to assemble. In every box, you have assembly manuals, like they look like the IKEA ones, and without text, it is only drawings and so on. But still, we want to make sure that everything is done properly, so that the quality of build it is there. So we provide also support, technical support online, and this is something that we find a challenge actually, when to reach people that they are really implementing in the ground. Like how to be able to have access to the people that they are really assembling the shelters. This is something that not always is easy, because we are working with organizations. Most of the time they are very big, and it's hard to go through all the layers and be able to reach the ground. This is something that
Yeah. So I mean, we work with a lot of the big UN agencies, UNHCR. Historically, the UN Refugee Agency, we've partnered with over many years, and they were also developing the first shelter together with us under UNHCR innovation. So we get requests from these organizations. It can be UNHCR or the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies that we've worked with in several countries. And as Miguel said, they are the experts on the ground. So what we are experts on our shelter, and we can also come in and say, after the initial conversations with them, this is a fit or this is not a fit, because that reason. It can be it can be because of the climate, or it can be because there are more locally adaptable shelters available. We never push for our shelters to be used somewhere where they don't need to. Local solutions are almost always preferred if that's possible. So in many instances, local solutions can be implemented. So it's, it can be wood from a local vendor, and then corrugated iron sheets, or some kind of weave or mud. I mean, there are loads of different kinds of local solutions, as many as there are countries, basically. So those discussions are had in the beginning. Historically, we've worked a bit more in conflicts and protracted situations than in disasters, for example. In many cases, in after disasters, there are local material available. In protracted situations in Syria, for example, it's very difficult to source locally. The local supply chain may be broken, or because of high demand, the prices are very high, and so on. So it's those discussions are had in the beginning, and then of course, if there is a match and we can deliver, you have the trainings with their staff. Sometimes if it's a big implementation, we also go to the sites. During COVID, we learned to do this online as well. And we learned, I mean, just as everybody else in the world, that a lot of stuff could actually be done online. So we've saved a lot of air travel on that since then. Of course, we sometimes have to go to the sites to do trainings or follow-ups and so on. And then usually we do follow-ups after a few months or years, depending on how long the shelters are there and how big the projects are, just to see if there are maintenance that needs to be done. The shelter is also designed in a way that you can exchange panels, for example, or just remove the panels when they are not good anymore and exchange them to local material. So the whole thinking with our shelters is that it's something that can be implemented in right after the aftermath of a disaster or a conflict in an emergency, and then afterhand it can be turned into something not permanent but more comfortable. And that's with the help of this metal frame. So we've seen this in many places, and we hope to be able to do this more and more. In India, we implemented shelters with the metal frame again with tarpaulin, which would then be exchanged for local material after a while. Yeah, so that's basically how it's done. I mean, we have everything to thank our local partners and again, and we mentioned the big UN organizations and the Red Cross, but we work a lot with smaller NGOs as well, and they do a tremendous work. And sometimes those smaller NGOs are also implementing partners of the big organizations.
And Märta, because you alluded to the use of different materials and the fact that they can be exchanged or replaced by either the same material or the different one, my last question would be about the afterlife of the shelters. The production side is easier to understand because you get raw materials, you fabricate and you send. What happens when people move out, or if a refugee shelter, I mean, if the government provides for a more permanent housing for the refugees and all you have left behind is the shelters, what does that scenario look like? What happens when the refugee once the region is not in crisis anymore, or they've been rehoused?
So well, this is something that we find actually, and this is quite important because, for instance, I am having in mind now temporary hospital that it was a temporary transition shelter. So it was like I think 200 units, as average, the relief housing units, and it was run by 3 years. But then at some point in Colombia,
right? Yes.
Yeah, and then the migration influx of flows for people changed, so it is not needed anymore. So what the operation did, it was only used by 3 years, but they was really take care by the operation, and then they took most of the aerators and they disassembled them and they reused them somewhere else. So giving it a school program in the town, in the municipality nearby, because they were lacking infrastructure. And some panels that were not in good shape, they were trying to look for alternative solutions. So this is something that we are looking for even every time more, and we have a decommissioning strategy and guidelines to support the partners, how to handle the items that they have, the components of the shelters. So I think that first, what we encourage is, of course, reuse it, and then to do this incremental approach. But when you cannot do it anymore, we change actually our shelters, the panels, the composition of the plastic to make it easier to recycle. But again, in some places, you don't have any kind of recycling facility nearby. So this is something that we provide this the community guidelines to see how they can handle it. But this is like, I would say, not only for us in Better Shelter, but again for the whole humanitarian sector, it is a challenge that we are facing for the future. No, what do you do with everything that is in the ground when it is not needed anymore? Sadly, in many contexts, we found that these shelters are used forever because you don't have an alternative.
Yeah. Yeah, this
So even
goes back to our initial point about
yeah, so
the
Yeah.
temporality kind of converting into the permanence of being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, but this is something that we are working on, and we are having like some pilots with some partners in order to look for potential solution. But I say like waste management and all this, how to do the community of these shelters in many contexts, it is not a clear picture so far. So
But we're looking, I mean, we have an R&D team that are working on the next generation of shelters. And this is, of course, the main scope. So how can we make them more sustainably friendly, and how can they further be, I mean, easier to turn into something else when not needed as shelters anymore. It's already happening a lot. I mean, we have the steel pipes, which we've seen used as other things. I mean, everything from fences to being resold in the local market, and so on. And we have since 2 years a very good life cycle analysis mechanism in place, where we're measuring everything from cradle to gate.
so it means from the source of
Yes.
materials to the production line. So this is
Right.
something that we have the chance to map, and we are working with really nice factories providers that they are providing all this info, so we can really tell the carbon footprint of our shelters in the production level. But then when they are deployed to the field, this is something that is still is a question
You
mark.
need to be
and
mapped, yeah.
working on that because we've
No,
seen
absolutely. Yeah. And I think looking ahead at long-term product development, of course, we're looking at other types of material, bio-based, cardboard, whatever can be used that is even easier to recycle or turn into something else, or to handle. Exactly. So I think, I mean, a lot of work is put into that now, and it's very exciting. And it's when you're forced to look into these issues, you can always find solutions and find ways forward. But I think it's a challenge that we and the humanitarian sector are looking at, because again, the focus is to alleviate suffering and saving lives, right? So the focus has never been long term. It's been like, now we go in and we deal with this situation, and then we deal with what's left of it afterwards, you know. And now everyone's forced to looking into the afterwards as well. But the whole thinking with our shelters is, again, it's something that can be used in the beginning of a crisis and then turned into something else. And that's also what's the humanitarian sector is now trying in different ways to work better with the new reality we're in, where a lot of crises are protracted, and a lot of crises are a combination of a conflict and a disaster. So it's called the Humanitarian Development Nexus, where humanitarian organizations work together with development actors and states to work together. So it's not a division. Humanitarian organizations and humanitarian response is one thing, and then development is one thing. But actually thinking and working together.
Well,
Yes, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean there's so much work put into this at the moment. So I think we don't know really yet when the new version of our shelter is going to be released, but within a few years, we can safely say yes. And at the same time working with our partners to support them with the afterlife and recycling and so on. Yeah.
I think it's just commendable to be able to work or use design with such an intention and such a noble cause, I would say. But also beyond that, I think it's even more commendable to be able to navigate all these large organizations and all, bureaucratic structures, because it's not just your UNHCR, but you're also working with local governments, you're working with national governments. And I'm sure there's a lot of resistance also that you might be facing when it comes to working at like the hyper local level. So kudos for all your work, and we wish you all the best, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can follow us on Instagram at arcofcenter and reach out to us through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thanks for listening.